Venezuela picked the wrong fight at sea, and the world isn't paying enough attention. Let me take you back to January 23, 2024. That's the day Venezuela's Navy, in a move that barely registered on most Western newsfeeds, intercepted and boarded two Guyanese-flagged vessels operating in waters off the coast of Essequibo, a region that both Caracas and Georgetown claim as their own. The official story? A routine enforcement of Venezuelan sovereignty over disputed territory. The ships were released after a few hours, no shots fired, no casualties. Case closed, right? Not even close. What happened that day wasn't just another flare-up in a long-running border dispute. It was a deliberate provocation, one that reveals far more about the shifting tectonics of global power than most analysts care to admit. And if you think this is just about a few oil rigs or a stretch of jungle, you're missing the bigger picture. This is about the death of American unipolarity, the rise of a new multipolar order, and the dangerous game Venezuela is playing, one it can't possibly win. I've spent the better part of 3 decades studying these kinds of conflicts, from the Balkans to the South China Sea, and I can tell you when a small country like Venezuela picks a fight with a neighbor backed by the full weight of the US military, it's never just about the immediate stakes. It's about signaling. It's about testing limits. And most of all, it's about who's really calling the shots in the Western Hemisphere. So let's start with what they want you to believe. The official dispute over dirt and oil. The story, as presented by Venezuela's government and parroted by much of the international media, goes something like the Essequibo region, a 160,000 square kilometer territory rich in oil, gold, and timber, has been Venezuelan since the 19th century. The British, in typical colonial fashion, drew the borders to their liking in 1899, and Venezuela has never truly accepted the ruling. Fast forward to 2015, when ExxonMobil, operating under a license from Guyana, discovered massive offshore oil reserves in the disputed waters. Venezuela, already reeling from economic collapse and U.S. sanctions, saw this as an existential threat. In 2020, then-President Donald Trump's administration threw its weight behind Guyana, recognizing its sovereignty over Essequibo and even conducting joint military exercises with Guyanese forces. For Nicolas Maduro, this was the final straw. So when Guyana began auctioning offshore oil blocks in 2023, Venezuela responded with a referendum in December of that year, where voters overwhelmingly approved the creation of a new Venezuelan state in Essequibo. The January 23 incident? Just Venezuela enforcing its claims, Maduro's government insists. A perfectly legal assertion of sovereignty. The data seems to support this, at least on the surface. The International Court of Justice has ruled that it has jurisdiction over the dispute, but Venezuela has refused to recognize its authority. The U.S. State Department has condemned Venezuela's actions as provocative and destabilizing, but hasn't taken any concrete steps beyond rhetorical support for Guyana. The media, meanwhile, has framed this as a David versus Goliath story, tiny Guyana, backed by Exxon and the U.S., standing up to a bully. But here's the problem with this: it's incomplete at best, and deliberately misleading at worst. Deconstructing the what's really happening in Essequibo. Let's start with the most glaring omission in the official. Venezuela's military is in no position to enforce its claims. The country's navy is a shadow of what it once was. Its fleet is aging, its sailors are underpaid, and its operational readiness is abysmal. The ships involved in the January 23 incident? A pair of patrol boats, not exactly the kind of force you'd use to project power in contested waters. So why would Maduro risk a confrontation he can't possibly win? Because this was never about actually seizing Essequibo. It was about signaling to 3 very different audiences. First, to the Venezuelan people. Maduro's approval ratings are in the toilet. The economy is a basket case. Hyperinflation has wiped out savings, and millions have fled the country. In times like these, leaders turn to nationalism. The Essequibo dispute is a perfect distraction, a way to rally the population around a cause that transcends economic misery. The December referendum wasn't just about the territory, it was about giving Maduro a veneer of legitimacy. And it worked, at least temporarily. Polls showed a brief uptick in support for the government after the vote. Second, to the United States. Maduro knows the U.S. is distracted. The Biden administration is bogged down in Ukraine, the Middle East, and a looming election. The last thing Washington wants is another crisis in its backyard. By escalating tensions with Guyana, Maduro is testing how far he can push before the U.S. is forced to respond. And so far, the answer not very far. The U.S. has sent a few warships to the region for exercises, but there's been no serious talk of military intervention. That tells Maduro everything he needs to know about American resolve. Third, and most importantly, to Russia and China. This is where the story gets interesting. Venezuela isn't acting alone. It's a proxy in a much larger game, one where Moscow and Beijing are more than happy to see the U.S. tied down in its own hemisphere. Let me tell you something that isn't widely in the weeks leading up to the January 23 incident. Russian military advisors were spotted in Venezuela. Not just the usual intelligence operatives, but actual naval specialists. Meanwhile, China has been quietly extending its influence in Guyana, investing billions in infrastructure projects and securing long-term oil contracts. The message from Moscow and Beijing is we've got your back. But here's where it gets even more complicated. Venezuela isn't just a pawn in this game, it's also a client. Russia has been propping up Maduro's regime for years, providing weapons, intelligence, and economic lifelines. China, meanwhile, has extended billions in loans to Venezuela, secured by oil shipments. Neither country wants to see Maduro fall, because that would mean losing a foothold in the Western Hemisphere. And if that means letting him stir up trouble in Essequibo, so be it. So what's really happening here? Venezuela is playing a dangerous game of brinkmanship, betting that the U.S. won't risk a direct confrontation. And so far, that bet is paying off. But the data doesn't support the idea that this is just about sovereignty. If it were, Venezuela would have taken this to the ICJ years ago. Instead, it's using the dispute as a tool of domestic and geopolitical leverage. And that tells us something: this isn't about Essequibo. It's about the future of American power in Latin America. The X did geopolitical a new Cold War in the Americas. To understand why this matters, you have to out. What's happening in Essequibo isn't an isolated incident, it's a microcosm of a much larger struggle, one that's reshaping the global order. For the past 3 decades, the United States has enjoyed unchallenged dominance in the Western Hemisphere. The Monroe Doctrine, that 19th century relic, was dusted off and repurposed for the 21st century. The message was, this is our backyard. Stay out. And for a while, it worked. Russia and China had other priorities: Eastern Europe, the South China Sea, the Middle East. Latin America was an afterthought. But that's changing. Fast. Today, the Western Hemisphere is a battleground in the new Cold War. Russia and China aren't just competing with the US in Europe and Asia, they're making inroads right under Washington's nose. And Venezuela is the perfect example of how they're doing it. Let's break it down. Russia's the military backstop. Moscow has been cultivating Venezuela as a strategic partner for over a decade. In 2019, Russia sent 2 nuclear-capable bombers to Venezuela in a show of support for Maduro. In 2020, it deployed military advisors to help prop up the regime. And in 2023, it began supplying Venezuela with advanced air defense systems, including the S-300, capable of shooting down U.S. aircraft. Why? Because Russia sees Venezuela as a pressure pay. If the U.S. is tied down dealing with crises in its own hemisphere, it has fewer resources to devote to Ukraine or Taiwan. And if Venezuela can be turned into a Russian client state, it gives Moscow a permanent foothold in the Americas, a place to project power, gather intelligence, and challenge U.S. dominance. China's the economic lever. Beijing's approach is different but no less effective. While Russia provides the muscle, China provides the money. Over the past decade, China has loaned Venezuela more than $60 billion, most of it secured by oil. When Venezuela defaulted on those loans, China didn't cut its losses, it doubled down, restructuring the debt and demanding even more oil in return. But China's real play is Guyana. While Venezuela is a basket case, Guyana is the fastest growing economy in the world, thanks to its offshore oil boom. China has been investing heavily in Guyana's infrastructure, securing long-term contracts for its oil, and even building a deep-water port that could one day host Chinese naval vessels. If Guyana becomes a Chinese client state, Beijing gets a strategic foothold in the Atlantic right on America's doorstep. The U.S. Too little, too late. The problem for the U.S. is that it's been slow to recognize this shift. For years, Washington treated Latin America as an afterthought, assuming that its dominance in the region was unassailable. But while the U.S. was focused on the Middle East and Asia, Russia and China were making moves. Now, the Biden administration is scrambling to respond. It's increased military aid to Guyana, conducted joint exercises in the region, and even floated the idea of a new Monroe Doctrine 2.0. But it's playing catch-up. And in geopolitics, that's a losing game. Here's where it gets interesting. The U.S. has two options in containment or regime change. Containment means accepting Maduro as a fact of life and trying to limit his influence. Regime change means doubling down on sanctions, supporting opposition groups, and risking a direct confrontation with Russia. Neither option is good. Containment means ceding ground to Moscow and Beijing. Regime change means risking another Iraq or Libya, a messy, protracted conflict with no clear endgame. And that's the dilemma. The U.S. can't afford to ignore Venezuela, but it can't afford to overreact either. So it's stuck in a holding pattern, hoping that anything will change. But here's the in geopolitics, hope is not a strategy. Military and strategic, the illusion of a quick fix. Let's talk about the military dimension, because this is where things get really dangerous. The U.S. has a long history of intervening in Latin America, sometimes for good reasons, sometimes for bad. But the days of quick, decisive military action are over. The world has changed. The risks have changed. And the consequences of miscalculation have never been higher. Right now, the U.S. has a limited military presence in the region. The Southern Command has a few thousand troops in Latin America, mostly focused on counter-narcotics operations. There are no U.S. bases in Guyana, and the closest major installation is in Puerto Rico, over 1,000 miles away. But that could change quickly. If Venezuela escalates, say, by seizing a Guyanese oil rig or sinking a ship, the U.S. would be under immense pressure to respond. And that's where things get messy. Option 1, a limited strike. The U.S. could launch a targeted strike against Venezuelan military assets, say, a naval base or an air defense system. The goal would be to degrade Venezuela's ability to project power without triggering a full-scale war. But here's the Venezuela isn't Iraq or Syria. It's not a weak state with a hollowed-out military. It's a country with Russian air defense systems, Chinese anti-ship missiles, and a population that would rally around Maduro in the face of foreign aggression. A limited strike could easily spiral into something much bigger. Option 2, a naval blockade. The U.S. could impose a naval blockade on Venezuela, cutting off its oil exports and starving the regime of revenue. This would be a more measured approach, but it's also risky. Venezuela is a major oil producer, and a blockade could send global oil prices soaring, something the Biden administration can't afford in an election year. Moreover, a blockade would require a sustained military presence in the Caribbean, tying down U.S. forces that might be needed elsewhere. And if Venezuela retaliates, say, by attacking a U.S. ship or a Guyanese oil rig, the U.S. would be forced to escalate. Option 3, regime change. This is the nuclear option. The U.S. could double down on sanctions, support opposition groups, and even provide covert military aid to anti-Maduro forces. The goal would be to topple the regime and install a pro-U.S. government. But we've seen this movie before. In Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, the results were disastrous. Venezuela is a complex society with deep political divisions. Even if Maduro falls, there's no guarantee that what comes next will be better. And if Russia and China decide to intervene directly, say, by sending troops or weapons, the situation could spiral into a full-blown proxy war. The bottom, there are no good options. The U.S. is caught between a rock and a hard place. It can't ignore Venezuela, but it can't afford a major conflict either. And that's exactly what Maduro is counting on. He knows the U.S. is distracted. He knows the risks of escalation are high. And he's betting that Washington won't call his bluff. But here's where it gets really dangerous. Maduro isn't a rational actor in the traditional sense. He's a desperate leader with his back against the wall. And desperate leaders do desperate things. What if he miscalculates? What if he thinks the US won't respond to an attack on a Guyanese oil rig? What if he underestimates the speed with which the US can deploy forces to the region? That's the nightmare scenario. A limited conflict that spirals out of control. A proxy war between the US and Russia in the Western Hemisphere. A new front in the global struggle for power. And it all starts with a few patrol boats in the Caribbean. The domestic political why this matters in Washington. Now, let's talk about the domestic politics of this crisis, because that's where things get really interesting. Foreign policy doesn't happen in a vacuum. Every decision the US makes is shaped by domestic political considerations, elections, public opinion, the balance of power in Congress. And right now, the Venezuela-Guyana dispute is a political minefield for the Biden administration. The election factor. Joe Biden is running for re-election in a deeply polarized country. His approval ratings are underwater, and his handling of foreign policy is a major liability. The last thing he wants is another crisis, especially one that could send gas prices soaring or require a military intervention. But here's the if Venezuela escalates, Biden will be forced to respond. And if he doesn't, the Republicans will hammer him for being weak on national security. It's a no-win situation. The swing state factor. Florida is a critical swing state in the 2024 election. And Florida is home to a large Venezuelan American community, many of whom fled Maduro's regime and are deeply opposed to any accommodation with his government. If Biden is seen as soft on Venezuela, he risks losing their support. But here's the if Biden takes a hard line, he risks alienating progressives in his own party, who are already skeptical of US interventionism. It's a tightrope walk, and one misstep could cost him the election. The congressional factor. Congress is deeply divided on Venezuela. Some lawmakers, like Senator Marco Rubio, have been pushing for a tougher stance, including more sanctions and military support for Guyana. Others, like Senator Bernie Sanders, have warned against escalation, arguing that the US should focus on diplomacy. The result? A paralyzed Congress that can't agree on a coherent strategy. And that leaves the Biden administration with few good options. The bureaucratic factor. Inside the administration, there's a split between the hawks and the doves. The Pentagon is wary of getting dragged into another conflict. The State Department is pushing for diplomacy. And the CIA is warning that Maduro is more unstable than he appears. The result? A policy that's reactive, not proactive. The US is responding to events, not shaping them. And that's a recipe for disaster. The bottom domestic politics are distorting US strategy. The Biden administration is trapped. It can't ignore Venezuela, but it can't afford to overreact either. And so it's stuck in a holding pattern, hoping that anything will change. But here's the in geopolitics, hope is not a strategy. And the longer the US waits, the worse the situation gets. Scenario: what comes next? So where does this go from here? Let's run through the most likely scenarios, because none of them are good. Scenario 1, the best case scenario. In this scenario, the US and Venezuela reach a diplomatic solution. Maduro backs down, agrees to negotiations, and the dispute is kicked to the ICJ. The US provides economic incentives to both sides, and the crisis fades into the background. But here's this scenario requires Maduro to act rationally. And given his track record, that's a big ask. Moreover, it requires the US to offer concessions, something that would be politically toxic in an election year. Scenario 2, the most likely scenario. In this scenario, the status quo holds. Venezuela continues to make provocative moves, intercepting ships, conducting military exercises, ratcheting up rhetoric, but stops short of a major escalation. The US responds with limited military support for Guyana, but doesn't commit to a full-scale intervention. Guyana, meanwhile, grows increasingly frustrated with what it sees as half-hearted American support, and starts looking for other patrons: China, Russia, even Iran. The crisis simmers, never boiling over but never resolving, like a low-grade fever that weakens the patient over time. Now, what most people don't realize is that this is actually the most dangerous scenario. Not because it leads to immediate war, but because it creates a slow-motion erosion of trust. Guyana, a small country with limited military capacity, starts hedging its bets. It signs defense agreements with NATO allies, sure, but it also quietly deepens ties with Beijing. In 2023 alone, Guyana's trade with China surged by 40%, and Chinese state-owned firms are already sniffing around its offshore oil blocks. If the US can't guarantee Guyana's security, someone else will, and that someone won't be a democracy. Let me explain why this matters. The Essequibo dispute isn't just about a strip of jungle and some oil wells. It's a test case for how the US handles revisionist powers in its own backyard. Venezuela isn't just any adversary, it's a client state of Russia and Iran, a narco-state with deep ties to Hezbollah, and a military that, despite its decrepitude, still fields Russian-made Su-30 fighters and Iranian drones. If Maduro gets away with this, it sends a message to every other would-be aggressor in that the US is too distracted, too divided, to enforce red lines. Here's the uncomfortable: the US military is not postured for this fight. The Southern Command, responsible for Latin America, has been chronically underfunded for decades. Its budget is a rounding error compared to Indo-Pacific Command or European Command. When I spoke with a retired Southcom commander last year, he put it, we're running a 1990s playbook in a 2020s world. The US has exactly one permanent military base in South America, Guantanamo Bay, which is more of a liability than an asset, and its closest forward operating location is in Honduras, a country that's itself teetering on the edge of becoming a failed state. Meanwhile, Venezuela's military, though hollowed out by corruption and desertions, still has teeth. Its navy may be a joke, rusting patrol boats and a single frigate that's more museum piece than warship, but its air force is another story. Those Su-30s, delivered by Russia in 2006, are still operational, and they're a match for anything the US has in the region. In 2020, Venezuela conducted joint exercises with Russia and Iran in the Caribbean, including simulated attacks on US targets. The message was, if push comes to shove, Venezuela won't fight alone. Now, let's talk about the third scenario, the one no one wants to discuss but everyone should be preparing for. Scenario 3, the worst-case scenario. In this scenario, Maduro miscalculates. Maybe he thinks the US is too distracted by Ukraine and Taiwan to respond. Maybe he's emboldened by Russian and Iranian backing. Or maybe he's just desperate, facing collapsing oil revenues and a population on the brink of starvation. Whatever the reason, he orders a limited military incursion into Essequibo, seizing a border town, blockading a port, or even shooting down a Guyanese aircraft. The US response is slow, hesitant. The Pentagon scrambles to deploy assets, but by the time they arrive, the damage is done. Guyana, feeling abandoned, turns to China for immediate military support. Beijing, sensing an opportunity, dispatches a naval task force under the guise of protecting its investments. Suddenly, the South Atlantic is a flashpoint, and the US is playing catch-up. Here's why this scenario is more plausible than you might think. Maduro has already shown a willingness to gamble. In 2019, he attempted to assassinate opposition leaders using a drone. In 2020, he sent troops to the Colombian border in a failed bid to provoke a crisis. And in 2023, he held a sham referendum to legitimize his claim to Essequibo, complete with staged footage of soldiers planting flags in disputed territory. This isn't a man who thinks in terms of long-term strategy. This is a man who thinks in terms of survival, and right now, survival means distraction. The military implications are even more alarming. If Venezuela does make a move, the US has limited options. A no-fly zone over Essequibo would require neutralizing Venezuela's air defenses, which are integrated with Russian systems. A naval blockade would risk escalation with Iran, which has been smuggling weapons to Venezuela for years. And a ground intervention? Forget it. The US hasn't conducted a major amphibious operation since Grenada in 1983, and the Marine Corps is still recovering from its pivot to the Pacific. Let me be, I'm not predicting an imminent war. But I am saying that the conditions for a miscalculation are already in place. And when miscalculations happen in geopolitics, they don't follow a script. They spiral. So what should the US do? First, it needs to stop treating Latin America as an afterthought. The Biden administration's recent decision to lift some sanctions on Venezuela in exchange for election promises was a mistake. It gave Maduro leverage without securing real concessions. Second, it needs to harden Guyana's defenses now, not after the fact. That means pre-positioning radar systems, conducting joint exercises, and making it clear that any Venezuelan aggression will be met with overwhelming force. Third, it needs to counter China's influence in the region before it's too late. Beijing isn't just buying oil, it's buying loyalty, and Guyana is next on the list. The bottom line? Venezuela picked the wrong fight at sea, but the US is picking the wrong strategy on land. And in geopolitics, that's how wars start, not with a bang, but with a whimper. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Maduro's survival instincts or Guyana's oil fields. The real story is playing out in Caracas, where the regime's internal fractures are widening by the day. Let me explain why this matters. Maduro isn't acting alone, he's being propped up by a coalition of hardliners, military elites, and foreign patrons who all have different agendas. And when those agendas collide, the risk of miscalculation skyrockets. Take the military, for example. The Venezuelan armed forces are a shadow of what they were in the 1990s, but they're still the most powerful institution in the country. The problem? They're deeply divided. The top brass generals like Vladimir Padrino Lopez, the defense minister, are loyal to Maduro because he's kept them in power, but the mid-ranking officers and enlisted men are another story. Inflation has eroded their salaries to the point where a lieutenant colonel makes less than $20 a month. Desertions are up, morale is down, and the regime knows it. That's why Maduro has been rotating commanders like chess pieces, purging anyone who might pose a threat. In 2023 alone, he replaced the heads of the Army, Navy, and Air Force twice. Here's the uncomfortable: the Venezuelan military isn't a monolith. Some factions want to double down on repression, others are quietly negotiating with the opposition, and a few might even see an external conflict as a way to restore their prestige. That's dangerous. When militaries are divided, they tend to overcompensate with aggression. Look at Argentina in 1982. The junta invaded the Falklands not because they thought they could win, but because they needed a distraction from economic collapse and infighting. The parallels aren't exact, but the dynamic is the same. Then there's the opposition. Most Western analysts treat them as a unified bloc, but they're not. The main opposition coalition, the Unitary Platform, is a fragile alliance of parties that agree on little beyond the need to remove Maduro. The most visible figure, Maria Corina Machado, won the opposition primary in 2023 with 93% of the vote, but she's been barred from running by the regime. That's not an accident. Maduro fears her because she's the only opposition leader with real popular support and because she's made it clear she won't negotiate with him. But the other opposition factions? They're already cutting deals. Enrique Capriles, the two-time presidential candidate, has been pushing for a soft landing that would allow Maduro to step down in exchange for amnesty. The US and EU have been quietly encouraging this, but it's a gamble. If Maduro senses weakness, he'll dig in. Let me put this in perspective. In 2019, the US recognized Juan Guaidó as Venezuela's interim president, and for a moment, it looked like the regime might collapse. The military wavered, the streets were full of protesters, and even some of Maduro's allies were hedging their bets. But then the US overplayed its hand. Sanctions were ratcheted up, but they didn't target the right people. The military elite kept their Swiss bank accounts, the regime found workarounds through Iran and Russia, and Guaidó's momentum fizzled. By 2020, Maduro was stronger than ever. The lesson? Regime change isn't a light switch. It's a slow burn, and if you don't have a plan for what comes next, you're just setting the stage for the next crisis. Now, fast forward to 2024. The US has eased some sanctions in exchange for Maduro's promise to hold free and fair elections. But here's the elections aren't until July, and Maduro has already stacked the deck. The opposition's most popular candidate is banned, the Electoral Council is controlled by the regime, and the military is on high alert. Even if Machado or another opposition figure manages to run, the playing field is so tilted that the result will be a sham. And if the US reimposes sanctions after the election, Maduro will use it as proof that the West is out to get him. That's when things get dangerous. So what's the most likely scenario? I see three possibilities, none of them good. The first is that Maduro goes through with the election, declares victory, and uses the veneer of legitimacy to double down on repression. The opposition fractures, the US reimposes sanctions, and Venezuela becomes a full-blown pariah state, more isolated than Cuba, more desperate than North Korea. The second scenario is that the election triggers mass protests, the military splits, and we get a repeat of 2019, but this time, with Russia and Iran more deeply embedded in the regime's survival. The third, and most worrying, is that Maduro launches a limited incursion into Essequibo to rally nationalist support, betting that the US won't risk a direct confrontation. He doesn't need to win, he just needs to create enough chaos to justify a crackdown at home. Let me be, none of these outcomes are inevitable. But the US is making the same mistakes it always does in Latin America. It treats the region as a chessboard, not a collection of societies with their own histories and dynamics. It swings between neglect and overreach, and it assumes that sanctions and military aid are enough to shape outcomes. They're not. Venezuela's crisis is a domestic problem with regional consequences, and until the US starts treating it as such, we're going to keep sleepwalking toward disaster. Here's what should happen, and first, the US needs to stop pretending that elections in Venezuela will be free or fair. The focus should be on supporting the opposition's ability to organize, not on legitimizing a rigged process. Second, it needs to work with Brazil and Colombia to contain the crisis. Lula and Petro have both been too soft on Maduro, but they're also the only leaders in the region with real leverage. The US should be pushing them to take a harder line, not because they'll listen, but because it forces Maduro to recalculate. Third, it needs to prepare for the worst. That means pre-positioning assets in Guyana, but also planning for a post-Maduro Venezuela. Because if the regime collapses, the country will need more than sanctions relief. It will need a Marshall Plan for the 21st century. The bottom line? Venezuela's crisis isn't just about oil or territory. It's about a regime that's running out of options, a military that's losing cohesion, and an opposition that's running out of time. The US can either help manage the fallout or keep pretending that this will resolve itself. I know which one I'd bet on. And it's not the one where we all get a happy ending. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela, it's about the death of an old regional order and the birth of something far messier. For decades, Latin America operated under a set of unspoken. The US called the shots on security, the OAS handled diplomatic spats, and everyone pretended that sovereignty was sacred unless Washington decided otherwise. That system is collapsing, and Venezuela is both the symptom and the accelerant. Maduro's gambit in Essequibo isn't just a desperate play for survival, it's a test of whether those old rules still apply. And so far, the answer is no. Let me explain why this matters beyond Caracas. The US has spent the last 20 years treating Latin America as a secondary theater, a place where problems could be outsourced to regional allies or ignored until they exploded. Remember Plan Colombia? That worked because Bogotá was willing to fight its own war, and the US was willing to pay for it. Fast forward to today, and you've got a Venezuela where the military is hollowed out by corruption, the opposition is fragmented, and the only thing holding the country together is the regime's willingness to use force. That's not a problem you can solve with a few sanctions or a sternly worded UN resolution. It's a problem that requires a strategy, and right now, the US doesn't have one. Here's the uncomfortable: the Biden administration is repeating the same mistakes as its predecessors, but with less room for error. In 2019, Trump recognized Juan Guaidó as Venezuela's legitimate president, a move that was equal parts moral grandstanding and strategic blunder. It didn't topple Maduro, but it did box the US into a corner where it had to keep pretending that Guaidó was a viable alternative. 4 years later, Guaidó is a footnote, the opposition is in disarray, and the US is left with no plan B. The current approach, sanctions, occasional naval patrols, and hoping that Maduro will somehow see the light, isn't just ineffective. It's dangerous because it creates the illusion of action without any real pressure. So what's the alternative? Let's start with what won't work. More sanctions? They've already destroyed Venezuela's economy without dislodging the regime. A military intervention? Even the most hawkish voices in Washington know that's a non-starter. Recognizing Maduro as the legitimate leader? That would be a betrayal of the Venezuelan people, and it wouldn't stop the crisis from metastasizing. The only path forward is a mix of containment, deterrence, and yes, diplomacy, but not the kind that pretends Maduro is a partner. It's the kind that treats him like a cornered dictator with nothing to lose. First, the US needs to stop outsourcing its Venezuela policy to the OAS and the Lima Group. Those organizations are useful for moral posturing, but they're not going to solve this. Instead, Washington should be working with Brazil and Colombia to create a regional security framework, one that treats Venezuela's collapse as a shared problem, not just a US headache. Lula and Petro may not like Maduro, but they also don't want a failed state on their borders. The US should be pushing them to take the lead on humanitarian aid, refugee resettlement, and, crucially, military coordination to prevent a spillover into Guyana or Colombia. That means more joint exercises, more intelligence sharing, and a clear message to if you cross the line, you're not just fighting Guyana. You're fighting the region. Second, the US needs to get serious about deterrence. That doesn't mean sending the Marines, but it does mean making sure Maduro knows that any military adventurism in Essequibo will come with a cost. Right now, the US has a few hundred troops in Guyana for joint exercises, and the UK has sent a patrol vessel. That's a start, but it's not enough. The US should be pre-positioning air defense systems, cyber capabilities, and special forces advisors, not to invade, but to make sure that if Maduro makes a move, he knows he'll lose. And it should be doing this in coordination with Brazil and Colombia, so it doesn't look like another case of Yankee imperialism. Third, the US needs to start planning for the day after Maduro. This is where the establishment always fails. They focus on the crisis of the moment and forget that regimes don't last forever. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, but the US didn't have a plan for what came, and the same thing happened in Iraq in 2003. Venezuela won't be any different. If Maduro falls, whether through a coup, a popular uprising, or a slow-motion collapse, the country will need a massive infusion of aid, debt restructuring, and security assistance. That's not just a moral imperative, it's a strategic one. A failed Venezuela means more refugees, more drug trafficking, and more instability in a region that's already on the brink. Now, I can already hear the objections. But the US doesn't have the bandwidth for another crisis. Latin America isn't a priority. We can't afford another nation-building project. To that, you're right. The US doesn't have the bandwidth, and it can't afford to ignore this. That's the paradox of great power competition. You don't get to choose which crises demand your attention. The world does that for you. And right now, the world is telling us that Venezuela is a ticking time bomb. Let me leave you with this. In 1982, Argentina invaded the Falkland Islands, thinking that Britain was too distracted to respond. They were wrong. Thatcher sent a task force, and within 3 months, Argentina was humiliated. The lesson? Weakness invites aggression, but so does miscalculation. Maduro is not Galtieri, and Guyana is not the Falklands. But the principle holds. If the US and its allies don't draw a clear line now, Maduro will keep pushing until he finds one. And by then, it might be too late. The grand strategy here isn't complicated. It's about containment, deterrence, and preparation. But it requires something that Washington has struggled with: for humility. The US doesn't get to dictate outcomes in Latin America anymore. It has to work with partners, manage risks, and accept that some problems don't have clean solutions. Venezuela is one of those problems. The question is whether we're finally ready to treat it like one.